What's good, everyone? This is Dr. Nee Darko. Make sure you hit the subscribe button below so that you're always up to date on the new uploads as well as alerts on this show. The other thing that you can do to help build this community is make sure you leave a comment below. Let us know what you like, what you don't like about the show, and ultimately, let us know who's winning these arguments, because I need to know that I'm beating Renee in these debates. Run the tape. Now, the way in which you put it out, everything is common sense, right? It makes sense, right? Like the ideas, the policies, in essence, I think you've found the way, or I think we all, when you focus on the science and you focus on the end result as opposed to castigating the person, right? It's like saying someone is a racist. You can't really say someone's a racist. You can say, well, your behavior is racist, right? Or the end product is racist, or it has some type of, well, that's the end product. I get this point, but talk to us about, in this book, some of the simple policy recommendations that you make. I think it's very interesting the way how you describe them.
Yeah, there's a bunch of them out there. I'm not going to list them all out because
Right.
whenever I do, I'll of course forget some of them. I think number one, which, as you said, common sense, universal background checks, right? Like if I have a gun, I want to sell it to you, I ought to run a background check on you to make sure that you're not some criminal, abusing your spouse, that sort of thing. But unfortunately, 22% of firearm transactions skip that whole background check process. That's
How
one
many?
thing that needs 22%.
Wow.
So about 1 in 5. So that's one thing that just needs to be fixed. And again, if you look at the polling data, whether you're Republican, Democrat, Independent, pretty much everyone thinks that you should have a background check before you sell a gun to somebody else. Even gun owners think that. So that's one thing. Another thing is what we would call safe storage, and that can be a couple different things. It could mean child access prevention. It could mean that if you have a firearm that, you're keeping it locked, preferably separate from ammunition so that you don't have that risk of someone taking that firearm and harming themselves, whether it's intentionally or unintentionally. So that's another policy that's out there, a policy that's been demonstrated to save people's lives, but it's something that is not universal across all 50 states. That's the crazy thing about the United States, is that a lot of these policies are at the state level. We don't necessarily have a lot of these things implemented federally. And so there's room for improvement, but it sets up, from a scientific perspective, a natural experiment. So we can see, well, in states that have policy A versus states that don't have policy A, what kind of impact is there? There's other stuff included as well, including like community violence prevention initiatives, hospital violence intervention programs, those sorts of things. We talk about in the book.
So when you talk about that, you're talking about like Dr. Robert Gore's
Yeah,
Kavi up in Brooklyn, New York.
right. I talk about Rob's program. I talk about Kyle Fisher, who is on sort of a national organization called the Javi, which sort of helps to get all these programs started, coalesced, provide them resources to get them off the ground. So if you're at a hospital that doesn't have that, you want to try to get those going, like that's a good resource for you to reach out
Oh
to.
yeah, yeah.
So there's a bunch of things like that. We even talk about what I like to call the mental health paradox, which is one of those things that we always think, oh yeah, if we just screen people for mental health issues, then that's going to cut back on like violent crime or whatever, which is not necessarily true. This is something that, we heard during the vice presidential debate, which actually like caught my ear, because I think one candidate mentioned, we just need more mental health. And then the other vice presidential candidate corrected the record and was like, people with mental health issues aren't necessarily more
Yeah.
violent. They're actually more
I think
often
that got
victims.
lost. That got lost in
Yeah,
the back and forth. That got lost
it
in the
did.
back and
Yeah.
forth. Can you explain that again? Can you describe that guy? Because I cut you off actually while you were saying
Oh,
that.
yeah, yeah. No, I mean, I think the thing is that we assume, because what happens is, there's a shooting that's popularized on television and we're like, oh man, that person must be like mentally ill or whatever. Or you think like maybe they're schizophrenic or something like that. And that's not really the case. Um, you know, people with, people with mental illness in this country, are diagnosed all the time, right? Depression, anxiety, all that kind of stuff. Whether or not it's a serious mental illness is a completely separate issue. And even when you're talking about dealing with that, um, restricting firearms to people that have been involuntarily committed for something, doesn't necessarily save people's life. Now, this is the interesting part, because when I first started this book back in 2019, and I was reading that first iteration of the science of gun policy from Rand, it actually said, yes, it was. As I was reviewing the book, revising it, going through edits and getting it ready to print, that actually changed. That's the scientific process, right? You add more and more studies into sort of a meta-analysis or systematic review, things can change. And so I had to change the way I approach that. So now I approach it more a little agnostically. The reason why I call it a paradox, because there is a mental health problem in this country as it pertains to guns, but it's really suicide, which no one talks about. Like, how many times do you hear on the news somebody, died by firearm suicide? Like, never.
But we see it a lot. Within the ER and the trauma surgery world, we see that a lot.
But we actually see it a whole lot less than we probably otherwise would, because firearms are so deadly. If you think of it like a case fatality rate, like 85, 90%, most of the people that attempt it don't make it to the hospital because they're dead in the field. But that's really where, if we're thinking about mental health, we need to be focusing on is on that aspect of it, instead of using mental health as a boogeyman and a distraction. And that's where I think where the politics sort of starts to play into it, is because people on one side want to use it as a distraction and then not fund mental health supports for people, right? We miraculously don't have more mental health beds in the system to get folks out the ER that need help, but we keep talking about it as a problem.
If people understood the wait times, I think the hardest thing I've seen, and I've seen this a lot, is someone who has intent or has committed a certain act against themselves. Like, literally the process of trying to get them into inpatient psych hospitals or just placement inpatient is one of the hardest things ever.
Yeah, exactly.
Because there's either no room, or let's say the next day they change their mind or something like that. And because there's no room anticipated, they're like, well, you go home, come back when, it's just like, this is crazy. We see that a lot in these level 1 trauma centers, right? Like, can we get this person into inpatient? Nope, can't. I got a question for you. With the policy recommendations that you make, we always hear about this, the universal background check, waiting periods, restrictions on gun access for individuals with domestic violence histories. We hear about all that stuff.
Right.
Is that stuff from a federal standpoint, is that stuff like is it almost like can it be like an a la carte type thing? Or does it have to be like if you take one, you got to take it all? Because I just feel like if everybody agrees on it, then why is it so hard to implement at least universal background checks? Why is it so hard to individually get like waiting periods and so forth? Explain that to me.
I think there's a lot of weeds that get into that, right? So there are mental health checks, there are domestic violence checks out there, but there are loopholes in this. And this is one of the loopholes that law that was recently passed a couple of years ago, the Bipartisan Safer Communities Act, tried to resolve, one called the boyfriend loophole, right? So first of all, if you run a background check on somebody and they have a felony conviction for domestic violence, felony just means greater than a year sentence, then at that point, they are eliminated from owning firearms, right? If, let's say, their sentence is 364 days, or it becomes a misdemeanor, then that doesn't necessarily apply into that background check process. Or if it's, let's say, a boyfriend that's not cohabitating, that doesn't have a child, it's not a spouse of that individual, then they're not really required to be reported as well, even though that's the same violent person, same violent act. And so there's a federal floor on some of this stuff. And then different states top it up. So some states do have background checks on every firearm transaction. Some do have waiting periods. Some require licenses. Like, you'd have to get a license maybe in Hawaii or something to then be able to go out and buy a firearm, right? Which if you're feeling suicidal, puts time and space between you to be able to go out and buy one. Unlike if you're in Texas, if you want to go to a store, you can run over to one now. Within the time it takes to process that federal background check, that FBI background check, which on average is 2 minutes, you can walk out the store with a gun. I mean, there was recently like a shooting at Lakewood Church, Joel Osteen's church. You may have heard about that in the news. There's literally a store that sells guns walking distance from that church. Right. So in my mind, I'm like, I wonder if the person just, went to the store, bought the gun, walked over there, that kind of thing. That's the way I think. But that there's that floor you have from the federal, and then you have the states that can do things on their own on top of that. And that's where there's a lot of difference, state to state. And that variation allows us to look at the policies and then see what happens with firearm mortality as a result of it and be able to determine their effectiveness.